We are used to thinking of the Middle Ages as a time of nights and plague, but there was an enemy more terrifying than any sword. This enemy was invisible, relentless, and came into every home without asking permission. It was called the Little Ice Age, and it changed human history more than all the wars of that time. Watch the video to the end to learn how a temperature change of just a couple of degrees forced people to rebuild their homes and even burn their neighbors for the sake of illusory warmth.
The Lord's judgment has arrived.
What if I told you that the deadliest force in history was a simple thermometer? The period from the 14th to the 19th century was a real test of strength for the entire European civilization. Scientists still argue about the exact causes of this global cooling, citing volcanoes and solar activity among the culprits. But for the ordinary peasant, the reasons were irrelevant when the world he knew was collapsing before his eyes. The temperature dropped by only a few degrees, which seems like an insignificant fluctuation to us. However, for the fragile agriculture of the time, it was a death sentence. Summers became shorter, and winters stretched into endless months, consuming food supplies at an alarming rate. The growing season was shortened, and plants simply did not have time to ripen before the first frosts. Peasants watched in horror as the green fields that promised a harvest turned black overnight. The rains that had once brought life now fell for weeks on end, turning the fields into impassable swamps. The grain rotted right in the ground, leaving no hope for future bread. The world did not freeze instantly, as shown in movies. And that was the most frightening thing about the impending catastrophe. The cold came slowly, year after year, robbing people of warmth and sustenance. First, the vineyards disappeared in the northern regions, where excellent wine had previously been made. Then the fruits that had fed the local villages for centuries stopped ripening. The frontier of agriculture crept inexorably southward, leaving the northern settlements on the brink of extinction. People tried to adapt, but nature struck blow after blow with cynical methodicalness. Late spring frost killed winter crops, leaving barns empty before the start of summer. Crop failures became not an exception, but a frightening new norm for several generations. Food prices skyrocketed, making food unaffordable for most of the population. Cities filled with refugees from villages who sought refuge, but found only the cold stones of the pavements. The economies of entire countries began to crack under the pressure of climate collapse. Trade routes through mountain passes were blocked by snow and ice. The seas were so stormy that ships could not leave port for months. The usual connections between regions collapsed, isolating people in their misery. Each region was forced to survive on its own, relying solely on its meager resources. Chronicles of the time increasingly mention years without summer and great famine. Chroniclers describe snow falling in July and rivers frozen in September. These records are imbued with despair and incomprehension as to why the heavens were punishing people. No one knew when it would end or if the warm sun would ever return. Hope melted away faster than the meager reserves of firewood in the hearth. The wet and cold years created ideal conditions for the spread of plant and animal diseases. Epidemics decimated livestock, depriving people not only of meat and milk, but also of draft power. Without oxen and horses, working the frozen ground became hellish labor. The cycle was complete. Cold caused hunger, and hunger deprived people of the strength to fight the cold. Society began to slowly but surely deteriorate. Rulers tried to take measures by opening grain stores and regulating prices, but this was not enough. The climate turned out to be an enemy that could not be defeated by an army or a royal decree. It was a war of attrition where the enemy had endless resources and time. Humanity had to learn to live in new hostile conditions. We often complain about bad weather when a picnic is canceled or it rains. But back then, the weather was not just an inconvenience, it was a serial killer. It dictated who would live and who would die the following winter. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think modern society could withstand such a climatic test without losing its humanity? Write about it in the comments.
We count every crumb, for bread like this is a
Are you
luxury.
ready to learn the
It is a
truth
hard
about what
life,
our
and we are
ancestors
lucky to
really
have
ate?
even this much.
The next chapter will change your perception of poverty. Bread, which we often throw away today if it has gone stale, was an unattainable luxury in those days. Cereal crops, which formed the basis of the medieval diet, suffered most from the cold. Wheat, which required sun and heat, simply stopped growing in vast areas of Europe. It was replaced by more resistant but less nutritious rye and barley. But even these unpretentious cereals often did not survive until harvest due to constant rains. The grain rotted in sheaves right in the fields or froze in leaky barns. Flour became a scarce commodity for which people were willing to kill. Bread made from pure flour disappeared from the tables of even wealthy townspeople, becoming a symbol of unprecedented wealth. Ordinary people had to make do with substitutes that would be considered appalling today. People began adding anything to the dough that could somehow increase the volume of the baked goods. They ground acorns, chestnuts, and even dried tree bark into flour. They used oil cake left over from oil pressing and even dry grass. Such bread was heavy, bitter, and practically indigestible for an emaciated body. But it gave a deceptive feeling of satiety, allowing people to live another day. Hunger forced people to break centuries-old taboos in eating habits. Anything that ran, crawled, or grew in the nearest forest was eaten. Hunting wild animals became not a pastime for the nobility, but a matter of survival for entire villages. However, the animals in the forest suffered from the endless winter no less than the people. The situation in families became tragic when they had to decide who to give the last piece of food to. Mothers faced a monstrous choice, distributing crumbs of food among their children. Often, food was given to those who were stronger and had a better chance of surviving the winter. The weak, the sick, and the elderly were the first victims of this icy plague. The cold did not kill people directly. It acted more cunningly and subtly. Deprived of calories, the body could not generate enough heat to warm itself. People froze in their own homes, not because it was -40 outside. They froze because they had no fuel inside to keep the fire of life burning. Emaciated people became easy prey for any infection or cold. The common flu or pneumonia became a death sentence. Their immune systems, weakened by years of malnutrition, simply refused to fight disease. Villages were deserted not because of the cold itself, but because of the diseases that followed the famine. Social norms and morals began to crack under the pressure of empty stomachs. Cases of food theft became more frequent, followed by severe punishments. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades began to view each other as enemies. Hunger turned people into beasts, ready to tear each other's throats out for a sack of rotten grain. The chronicles of those years are full of horrific stories of cannibalism in the most affected regions. People went mad with despair, losing their humanity in the face of starvation. These were dark pages of history that people tried not to remember afterwards. But it is precisely these pages that show the true price of survival in an era of climate catastrophe. Hunger became a constant backdrop to life, its constant companion and greatest fear. It shaped the psychology of entire generations, teaching them to save every crumb and fear tomorrow. And how did the cold change the very concept of home and comfort, turning dwellings into fortresses in the struggle for warmth? Guess how long it took to turn an ordinary house into a complex engineering system for survival? At that time, the home ceased to be a place of rest and became the front line in the battle against the cold. Most houses of that era were completely unsuited to prolonged and severe cold. Thin walls and gaps in windows and doors let in the icy wind, blowing out precious heat in minutes. People found themselves hostages to their own architecture, designed for a milder climate. Heating was primitive and extremely inefficient, even in the best houses. A typical open hearth provided warmth only to those sitting close to the fire. Take a step to the side and you were back in the grip of the bitter cold. Firewood burned at an alarming rate, and gathering fuel required enormous physical strength. Fireplaces often smoked, filling rooms with acrid smog that stung the eyes. The lack of proper insulation forced people to find other ways to keep warm. The whole family slept in one bed, huddled together under a pile of skins and blankets. This was not a manifestation of tender feelings, but a harsh necessity for collective survival. The warmth of human bodies accumulated under a common cover, creating a tiny island of life. Loneliness in such a situation was tantamount to a death sentence from hypothermia. Pets were often brought into living quarters to save them and themselves. Having a cow or goat in the house was not a sign of extreme poverty, but a sensible engineering solution. A large animal acted as a living heater, raising the temperature in the room by several degrees. People were willing to put up with the smell of manure and cramped conditions for the sake of the animal's life-saving warmth. Hygiene took a back seat in such conditions. Washing in ice-cold water in an unheated house was dangerous. People did not take off their layers of woolen clothing, saturated with sweat and smoke, for months. The specific heavy smell became an integral part of everyday life, even in aristocratic homes. Windows, which had previously been a source of light, were now boarded up and covered with skins. Darkness became a constant companion for people who were saving on candles and oil. Life in the house came to a standstill at sunset, and everyone tried to move as little as possible. Unnecessary movements meant a loss of energy that could not be replenished. Inside the house itself, microzones with different temperatures and purposes were created. Life was concentrated around the hearth, while the far corners of the room froze through. The corners were covered with frost, and the water in the buckets froze overnight even indoors. It was a constant battle for every centimeter of warm space. Ventilation brought cold air, so houses were deliberately deprived of fresh air. Stale air, saturated with carbon monoxide and fumes, caused headaches and illness. But the fear of frost was stronger than the fear of suffocation and poisoning. People voluntarily walled themselves up in stone and wooden boxes. Houses required constant repair and maintenance to withstand the elements. Every crack had to be filled with moss or tow immediately. Roofs sagged under the weight of snow, threatening to bury the inhabitants alive. The struggle to maintain the integrity of their homes was a daily chore for all family members. Survival depended on the ability to turn one's home into an airtight capsule. And this applied not only to the poor, but also to the richest people of the era. If you think that kings lived in warmth and comfort, then give this a like, because the next chapter will destroy that myth. What if I showed you a moment when even the crown could not protect against the cold? The winter of 1709 went down in history as the Great Frost, the culmination of a climatic nightmare. Temperatures dropped to such extreme levels that Europe was literally frozen in horror. It wasn't just cold, it was a natural anomaly that broke the usual laws of physics. Even sunny Italy and southern France saw meters of snow. If the king, who had unlimited resources, was freezing, the fate of the common people was terrible. That winter, hundreds of thousands of people across Europe died, simply freezing in their beds. Birds froze in flight and fell to the ground as solid lumps of ice. Trees in gardens and forests split with a cannon-like roar as the frozen sap expanded. The entire winter crop, vineyards and orchards were completely destroyed. Europe's largest rivers, including the Rhine, Danube, and Seine, froze to the bottom. The ice was so thick that it could support heavily loaded carts with cannons. This stopped the work of watermills, and it became impossible to grind grain. People were left without flour, even if they had grain, which exacerbated the famine. The sea froze for several kilometers off the coast, cutting off port cities from supplies. Ships were trapped in the ice, their hulls cracking and breaking under the pressure. Fishermen were unable to go out to sea, depriving coastal regions of their only source of food. Trade came to a standstill, condemning millions of people to complete isolation. In a desperate attempt to entertain themselves or show their disregard for death, people organized fairs on the ice. On the frozen Thames in London, they built stalls, roasted oxen, and held festivities. But beneath this feigned merriment lay a primal fear of the future. Animals in barns froze to death despite their owners' efforts to keep them warm. The loss of livestock was enormous, which meant famine for many years to come. Wolves, driven mad by hunger, came out of the forests and attacked villages in broad daylight. People were afraid to leave their homes, even to gather firewood. The price of bread rose several times after that winter, causing a wave of riots. Governments were powerless to do anything in the face of a natural disaster of such magnitude. The Great Frost showed the complete helplessness of man before nature. It erased the line between rich and poor, equalizing them in the face of icy death. The consequences of this winter were felt for decades in the economy and demographics. Europe lost a significant part of its population, not in war, but in a silent battle with the cold. It was a lesson that humanity remembered for a long time. But the ice did not just kill people, it reshaped the very geography of the inhabited world. How exactly did the climate destroy entire civilizations and wipe them off the map? What if I told you that the guillotine of the French Revolution was sharpened by the cold? We are accustomed to looking for the causes of political upheaval in the ideas of philosophers and the ambitions of politicians. But often the real catalyst for history is the empty stomachs of ordinary people. A series of cold, crop-failing years at the end of the 18th century created the perfect breeding ground for rebellion. The Little Ice Age hit where it hurt most, the wallets and stomachs of the poor. Bread was the staple food in France, accounting for up to 90% of the diet. When the wheat harvest was destroyed by cold weather and rain, bread prices skyrocketed. Workers spent almost their entire daily earnings just to buy a loaf of bread for their families. Buying firewood or clothing was out of the question, and people were becoming impoverished before our eyes. Hunger breeds not only suffering, but also anger and a search for someone to blame. Peasants and townspeople saw that the nobility's warehouses were bursting with grain, while their children were dying. Cold winters exacerbated the sense of social injustice to the limit. The royal court, which continued to live in luxury, seemed not only distant, but hostile. The famous phrase, "If they have no bread, let them eat cake," became a symbol of this gulf. It doesn't matter if it was actually said. What matters is that the people believed it. The cold made social inequality unbearable, exposing all the ills of the feudal system. People who have nothing to lose but their chains and hunger become a formidable force. Rumors that the aristocrats were deliberately starving the people spread like wildfire. Conspiracy theories about a hunger pact stirred people's minds and pushed them into the streets. The anger that had been building up for years in cold huts was looking for an outlet, and that outlet was the storming of the Bastille and the fall of the monarchy. The weather played a cruel joke on the French monarchy in 1788. A terrible hailstorm destroyed the crops in the summer, and a harsh winter killed off any remaining hope. In the spring of 1789, the country awoke not only from its winter hibernation, but also from its political slumber. The climate crisis was the spark that ignited the powder keg of revolution. Of course, there were many reasons for the revolution, but it was the climate that made it inevitable here and now. The women's hunger marches on Versailles were driven not by Rousseau's ideas, but by the desire to feed their children. Political rhetoric fell on fertile ground of despair and deprivation. The cold became an invisible revolutionary standing in the ranks of the rebels. This is not the only example of how climate has influenced regime change throughout history. In China, the fall of the Ming Dynasty also coincided with a period of extreme cold and drought. Crop failures deprived the emperors of their mandate of heaven in the eyes of the people. Armies weakened by hunger were unable to contain rebellions and external enemies. Climate acts as a great equalizer and the most ruthless political critic. It tests state systems for strength in the harshest way possible. A regime that cannot feed and warm its subjects is doomed to fall. Cold knows no mercy and accepts no political compromises. But when people could not find a rational explanation for their misfortunes, they turned to mysticism. Are you ready to learn how an attempt to warm the world led to the fires of the Inquisition?
Everyone since the miller's barn burned. From the lightning and the tempest, good Lord, deliver us.
People in the Middle Ages and early modern times lived in a world permeated by religious consciousness. For them, the weather was not the result of air masses moving, it was God's will. If God sent cold and famine, it meant that the people or their rulers had sinned. But when prayers and repentance did not help, a frantic search for specific culprits among the people began. Fear of inexplicable natural phenomena demanded an outlet through aggression. It was at the peak of the Little Ice Age that the witch hunt in Europe was at its height. Statistics show a frightening correlation. The harsher the winter, the more fires burned in the spring. People needed a simple explanation for why crops were dying and livestock were perishing. A witch who had allegedly sold her soul to the devil and brought bad weather was the perfect scapegoat. The accusations were often absurd: causing hail, freezing a cow, bringing clouds. In the popular imagination, witches had the power to control the climate to the detriment of the Christian world. The courts were overflowing with neighbors denouncing each other. Often the victims were lonely, poor, or simply strange women who were unable to defend themselves. It was mass hysteria, fueled by preachers and pamphlets. It was believed that witches stole the fertility of the earth and the warmth of the sun. The destruction of the guilty was perceived as a magical act of purification of the world. People believed that by burning a witch, they were breaking their pact with the devil and restoring normal weather. In some regions of Germany and Switzerland, where the climate shock was particularly severe, executions took on industrial proportions. Entire villages were burned, sparing no one. It was a desperate attempt by society to regain control of the situation through sacrifice. The fires of the Inquisition were a terrible parody of the warmth that people so desperately needed. The authorities often condoned these processes in order to divert the anger of the people away from themselves. It was easier to let the crowd tear the witch apart than to explain why bread prices had risen. It was a valve for releasing the social tension that had built up due to hunger and cold. The psychology of a besieged fortress made people see enemies everywhere. In addition to witches, other marginalized groups were also blamed: Jews, vagrants, heretics. Any deviation from the norm was perceived as a threat to the well-being of the community. Fear made people cruel and intolerant. Society closed in on itself, rejecting everything foreign and incomprehensible. Religious processions and prayers for an end to rain or frost gathered thousands of people. The church tried to channel fear into faith, but often lost control of the fanatical crowd. It was a time when superstition triumphed over reason, accompanied by an icy wind. The darkness in people's souls matched the darkness outside the window. Over time, as the climate began to soften, witch hunts declined. But this period remained in history as an example of how natural disasters can drive entire nations mad. The constant cold forced the human body to work in extreme conditions. The body needed much more energy than usual to maintain its temperature. Calories were burned at a furious rate just to keep from freezing. The feeling of hunger was a constant companion, even when the stomach was technically full. The body demanded fuel for its internal furnace. The diet inevitably shifted towards fattier and heavier foods. Lard, fatty meat, and thick soups became the basis of survival if they were available. Fat provided the long-lasting energy that allowed people to stay warm throughout the day. A lean diet, which had previously been considered a virtue, was now life-threatening. People began to move more slowly, instinctively conserving precious energy. Excessive activity in the cold meant loss of heat and rapid fatigue. Life slowed down, became more measured and focused on conserving strength. Hibernation became not just a metaphor, but almost a physiological reality for peasants. The body adapted, activating protective mechanisms against hypothermia. Blood circulation in the extremities slowed down to conserve heat for vital organs. Frostbitten fingers and noses were commonplace and went almost unnoticed. People lived in a state of chronic cold stress. Darkness and cold affected hormonal balance and mental state. Depression, apathy, and loss of energy were widespread during the winter months. Lack of sunlight led to vitamin D deficiency and rickets in children. The physical health of the nation was undermined with each cold year. However, those who survived possessed incredible endurance and robust health. Natural selection was harsh, leaving only the fittest. Generations that grew up during the Little Ice Age were genetically more resistant to cold. Their metabolism adapted to make efficient use of scarce resources. The body became the last line of defense, the last stronghold of man. People learned to listen to their bodies, to understand their signals and needs. The ability to warm themselves with their breath and to huddle together properly while sleeping saved lives. It was the physiology of struggle, recorded at the level of instinct. Even people's height decreased on average during this period due to malnutrition. Humanity literally shrunk under the pressure of adverse conditions. But this physical degradation was compensated for by incredible strength of spirit and will to live. Survival was not a heroic feat, but hard physiological work. Every day was a test of endurance for every cell in the body.
Will the rains hold off today, do you think?
Doesn't look
The
like
answer to this question lies not in heroism, but in the phenomenal ability of humans to adapt. People survived not because they were stronger than nature, but because they were smarter and more flexible. They completely rebuilt their way of life, abandoning centuries-old traditions for the sake of efficiency. It was a triumph of pragmatism over habit. Agriculture changed beyond recognition, switching to new crops. Potatoes, brought from America, became the true savior of Europe. They grew underground, were not afraid of frost, and yielded a harvest even in cold summers. Those who were the first to plant this devil's root survived, while the conservatives died of starvation. The structure of society changed, and new forms of mutual aid and charity emerged. People realized that it was impossible to survive this nightmare alone. Communities became more united, taking care of orphans and widows. Collective survival became the only possible strategy. The development of trade made it possible to transport grain from less affected regions. The market, though cruel, became a mechanism for distributing resources. The first insurance companies and state reserve systems appeared. The crisis forced the creation of institutions that are still in operation today. People learned to use wind and water energy more efficiently than ever before. The Netherlands flourished during this period, using wind for land drainage and production. Technical progress did not stop, but rather accelerated under the pressure of necessity. Cold weather became a stimulus for invention. Human thinking became more rational and scientific. The search for the causes of disasters gradually shifted from mysticism to observation of nature. Systematic weather observations began to be made, and agronomic sciences appeared. People wanted to understand their enemy in order to defeat it. They survived because they knew how to endure and wait without losing hope. The stubbornness of the peasant who sows the field again and again after a crop failure saves civilization. It was the quiet courage of everyday life, which is rarely written about in textbooks. The history of the Little Ice Age is not so much a story of cold as it is one of human ingenuity. We are the descendants of those who did not give up, who found a way to keep warm and feed their children. Their genes and their experience live on in us. The Little Ice Age did not destroy humanity, but it changed it forever. It tempered the character of European civilization, teaching it thrift and ingenuity. Those who survived this endless cold became the ancestors of modern societies that built the industrial world. We stand on the shoulders of people who defeated a winter that lasted 500 years, and the question remains the same as it was centuries ago, hanging in the frosty air. If tomorrow the temperature drops by 3 degrees and winter does not end in March, will we be able to survive as they did? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe.